Overwatch, respond. Overwatch, come in. The voice crackling through the radio sounded calm at first, but everyone inside the command tent could hear the tension underneath it. Captain Ryan Mercer stared at the tactical display mounted on the wall while a cold wind rattled the canvas outside. The ridge known as Observation Point Echo sat nearly a mile from the nearest friendly position, a lonely stretch of rock and dust overlooking a narrow valley that insurgent forces had been probing for days. For the last 10 minutes, nobody had heard a word from the sniper assigned to that position. The room remained silent except for the steady hum of generators and the occasional burst of radio traffic from patrol units scattered across the region. A young communications specialist adjusted his headset and tried again. Overwatch, this is Falcon Base. Radio check. Nothing. Several soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew who was stationed on that ridge. Staff Sergeant Emma Carter. The same woman some of them had questioned less than 12 hours earlier. The same woman one senior NCO had openly doubted during the mission briefing. Outside, dawn had not yet arrived. Darkness still covered the mountains surrounding the forward operating base. On the main display, a drone feed showed little more than shadows moving across rough terrain. Captain Mercer folded his arms and kept his eyes fixed on the screen. "Any visual?" he asked. "Negative, sir," the drone operator replied. "Signal interference keeps cutting in and out." Another long moment passed. Then someone near the back of the room spoke the words nobody wanted to hear. "Maybe she's gone." The sentence hung in the air. Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to. Emma Carter had been alone on that ridge for hours. Intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity throughout the valley. If those reports were accurate, Observation Point Echo had become the most isolated and exposed position in the entire sector. The radio remained silent. Captain Mercer looked toward the operations map. Red markers covered the valley below the ridge. More than anyone liked. More than anyone expected. He remembered the briefing from the previous evening with uncomfortable clarity. The room had been crowded with officers, analysts, and squad leaders studying satellite images and terrain models. The mission itself seemed simple enough. Place a sniper in the overwatch position. Monitor movement. Report any unusual activity. Hold the high ground until sunrise. Yet when Emma's name appeared on the assignment board, the room had shifted. Some faces showed concern. Others showed disbelief. One voice in particular stood out. Master Sergeant Cole Bennett leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "She can't hold that position alone." Nobody laughed, but nobody challenged him either. Bennett had 20 years of combat experience and the respect of nearly everyone in the unit. His words carried weight. Emma had been sitting near the end of the table when he said it. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply looked at the mission packet in front of her and continued reviewing the terrain photographs. Bennett noticed her silence and pressed further. "That ridge is too exposed. One operator isn't enough." Still, Emma said nothing. She turned a page, studied a contour map, and made a small note with a pencil. The briefing continued, but the doubt remained. It spread through the room like smoke. Some wondered if Bennett was right. Others questioned why headquarters had assigned only one sniper to such a critical location. Through it all, Emma remained quiet. When the meeting ended, soldiers gathered their equipment and headed toward their quarters. Emma was the last person to leave. She paused beside the operations board, looked once more at the ridge she would occupy before sunrise, then picked up her rifle case and walked out into the night alone. Now, 12 hours later, her radio was silent, the drone feed was fading, and every person inside Falcon Base was staring at the same screen, waiting to discover whether Master Sergeant Bennett's prediction had been right all along. 12 hours earlier, the atmosphere inside Falcon Base had felt strangely ordinary. Mechanics moved between vehicles under floodlights. Radio operators monitored routine traffic. The smell of coffee drifted through the operations building as another long night shift settled in. Yet beneath the surface, tension was building. Intelligence analysts had spent the previous 48 hours tracking unusual activity across the valley. Small groups appeared where none were expected. Supply routes shifted. Observation reports arrived more frequently. Nobody could say exactly what was coming, but everyone agreed that something was changing. Staff Sergeant Emma Carter listened quietly as officers discussed possibilities around the briefing table. She sat near the corner of the room, her notebook open, writing only what mattered. Unlike many soldiers in the unit, she rarely spoke during meetings. Years of experience had taught her that the loudest voices were not always the most useful. Across the table, Master Sergeant Cole Bennett studied the terrain map projected onto the wall. His reputation had been built over 2 decades of deployments, and most people respected his judgment without question. When the assignment appeared identifying Observation Point Echo as a one-person overwatch position, his expression immediately darkened. "That ridge is isolated," he said. "The nearest support element is almost a mile away." Several heads nodded. The concern sounded reasonable. The terrain was difficult. The position sat high above the valley with little natural cover. Reaching it required a long climb through rocky slopes and narrow switchbacks. During daylight hours, anyone standing on the ridge could be seen from miles away. Bennett glanced toward Emma. "We should send a team." An intelligence officer shook his head. "The mission requires a low profile." Bennett leaned back in his chair. "Then choose someone else." The room became quiet. Emma continued studying the map. The silence seemed to frustrate Bennett more than any argument would have. "You really think one sniper can manage that position all night?" he asked. Emma looked up calmly. "I think the position can be managed." Her answer was simple. No attitude. No challenge. Just confidence delivered without emotion. A few soldiers exchanged looks. Others returned their attention to the briefing. Bennett folded his arms. "Confidence is not a plan." Emma nodded once. "No, sir. Preparation is." The conversation moved on, but the doubt remained. After the meeting ended, groups gathered in the hallway discussing the assignment. Some questioned the intelligence reports. Others questioned the deployment itself. More than a few questioned Emma. Most of them had never served alongside her. They knew her name but not her history. They saw a quiet woman carrying a rifle case. They did not see the years spent mastering field craft, observation, and patience. They did not know how many difficult environments she had already worked through. Emma seemed completely unaffected by the conversation surrounding her. She walked to the equipment room, completed her gear inspection, and reviewed every item with deliberate care. Batteries. Maps. Weather charts. Range cards. Communications equipment. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was overlooked. Outside, the temperature continued dropping as midnight approached. A cold wind swept across the base. Soldiers heading toward their quarters pulled jackets tighter around their shoulders. Emma adjusted the strap of her pack and stepped toward the perimeter gate. One of the younger specialists watched her leave and quietly asked another soldier, "Do you think she can really stay up there alone?" The older soldier looked toward the dark silhouette of the mountains and shrugged. "By sunrise," he said, "we are all going to find out." The trail to Observation Point Echo wound through steep rock formations and narrow stretches of mountain terrain that forced every step to be deliberate. Emma Carter moved steadily beneath a sky filled with stars, her boots scraping softly against loose gravel as she climbed higher above the valley floor. The farther she traveled from Falcon Base, the quieter the world became. The distant sounds of generators disappeared. Radio chatter faded into brief bursts of static. Soon there was only the wind moving through the ridges and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Her pack weighed nearly 50 pounds, but she carried it with the ease of someone who had repeated the same routine countless times. Every piece of equipment had a purpose. Every item had been checked twice before departure. She stopped briefly near a rocky outcrop and studied the terrain through a small monocular. Below her, the valley stretched for miles, a maze of dry riverbeds, dirt roads, and scattered compounds. During daylight it looked almost peaceful. At night it felt different. Shadows concealed movement. Distances became deceptive. Small details mattered. Emma checked her watch and continued upward. At Falcon Base, several soldiers gathered around a portable heater outside the operations building. Conversation eventually returned to the same subject. Observation Point Echo. Specialist Aaron Mills stared toward the dark mountains. I still do not understand why command sent only one person. Another soldier shrugged. Maybe they know something we do not. Or maybe they are taking a risk. Nearby, Master Sergeant Bennett listened without speaking. His eyes remained fixed on the ridgeline visible against the night sky. He had seen difficult assignments before. He had also seen experienced soldiers pushed beyond reasonable limits. Part of him believed this mission was asking too much from one operator. Back on the mountain, Emma finally reached the final approach to the observation site. The position occupied a natural shelf overlooking the valley nearly 1,000 feet below. Large boulders provided concealment from multiple directions. Sparse vegetation offered additional cover. Most importantly, the location provided an unobstructed view of the terrain stretching several miles in every direction. She set down her pack and immediately began working. There was no wasted motion. No hesitation. She established communications, confirmed coordinates, checked weather readings, and recorded wind conditions. Afterward she carefully positioned her optics and began observing the valley. Minutes turned into an hour. Then another. The temperature dropped steadily as midnight approached. Frost began forming on nearby rocks. Emma remained motionless. Patience was one of the least understood skills in military service. Many people imagine success came from dramatic moments. Emma knew it usually came from preparation and observation. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, a routine radio check arrived from Falcon Base. Observation Point Echo, status check. Emma pressed the transmit button. All quiet. Visibility remains good. No significant activity. Her voice sounded calm and professional. Nothing more needed to be said. Captain Mercer heard the report inside the command center and nodded. Everything appeared normal. Yet the drone operator monitoring the valley noticed something unusual. Small heat signatures appeared briefly along a distant ridgeline before disappearing again. The operator adjusted the display and frowned. "Sir, I may have something." Mercer stepped closer. The images were unclear. The movement lasted only seconds. Then it vanished. The valley became still once more. Hundreds of yards away, Emma lowered her binoculars slightly and continued watching the darkness. Somewhere beyond the ridges, something had changed. She could not yet explain why. She simply felt it. And over the years, she had learned to trust that feeling. The feeling stayed with Emma long after the valley returned to silence. She remained behind her optics, studying every ridge, road, and shadow visible beneath the moonlight. Experience had taught her that unusual activity rarely appeared all at once. It revealed itself through small details. A light where no light belonged. A vehicle stopping in an unexpected location. Movement that seemed insignificant until viewed as part of a larger pattern. At 2:15 in the morning, she noticed the first sign. A narrow trail along the eastern side of the valley showed intermittent movement. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately draw attention. Yet the pattern repeated several times within a few minutes. Emma adjusted her observation angle and continued watching. Back at Falcon Base, the drone operator reported additional heat signatures appearing across multiple sectors. Captain Mercer listened carefully as analysts compared reports. None of the information seemed alarming by itself. Together, however, it suggested coordination. Mercer reached for the radio. Observation point echo, what are you seeing? Emma answered immediately. Increased movement along the eastern approach. Activity remains organized. Recommend continued monitoring. The calmness in her voice surprised some of the younger personnel listening from the communication station. She sounded as though she were discussing the weather rather than a developing situation. Mercer acknowledged the report and turned toward his staff. Keep tracking everything. Over the next 30 minutes, more indicators appeared. Small groups moved through terrain that had remained empty for days. Several routes converged toward key sections of the valley. Nothing happened quickly. The change was gradual, almost methodical. Emma recorded every observation in her notebook. Wind conditions. Distances. Reference points. Estimated travel times. The process looked ordinary to anyone unfamiliar with her work. In reality, she was building a picture that few others could see. Shortly before 3 o'clock, she transmitted another update. Movement is increasing. This time the command center grew noticeably quieter. The analysts no longer debated whether something was happening. The only question was what it meant. Master Sergeant Bennett stood near the operations display watching icons appear across the digital map. He folded his arms. Maybe we should pull her back. Mercer shook his head. Not yet. Bennett looked unconvinced. She is still alone. Mercer did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on the incoming reports. High above the valley, Emma shifted slightly to relieve pressure in her shoulders. It was the first significant movement she had made in nearly an hour. The cold air bit through her gloves. Frost covered sections of rock around her position. Yet her concentration never drifted. Through her optics she observed something that finally confirmed her suspicions. The scattered movement across the valley was not random. Separate groups were timing their travel carefully. Distances between them remained consistent. Routes complemented one another. Someone was organizing the activity. Emma pressed the transmit button. Falcon Base, I believe these movements are connected. The drone operator immediately redirected sensors toward the areas she identified. Minutes later, the analysts reached the same conclusion. Captain Mercer slowly nodded. She saw it first. Several people in the room exchanged surprised glances. Bennett remained silent. The valley below continued changing. What had appeared to be isolated movement now resembled the early stages of a coordinated operation. Yet despite the growing tension, Emma showed no sign of concern. She simply continued observing, recording details others missed, and quietly staying several steps ahead of everyone watching from the safety of the base. By 3:30 in the morning, the atmosphere inside Falcon Base had changed completely. Nobody treated the reports as routine anymore. Every new update from the valley was studied carefully. Every movement on the drone feed received attention. Yet the person providing the clearest picture remained the lone observer sitting nearly 1,000 feet above the valley floor. Emma Carter continued transmitting short, precise updates at regular intervals. She never speculated. She never exaggerated. She simply reported what she saw. Captain Mercer noticed something unusual as he reviewed her observations alongside the drone footage. Emma consistently identified important developments several minutes before the sensors confirmed them. At first he assumed it was coincidence. After the 5th time, he knew it was not. The drone operator noticed it too. Sir, she keeps calling it before we do. Mercer nodded slowly. I know. Across the room, analysts adjusted maps and overlays while comparing movement patterns. More groups were appearing throughout the valley. Some followed trails. Others moved through terrain that seemed difficult to navigate in darkness. Yet despite the growing activity, Emma never focused on the largest groups. Instead, her attention repeatedly shifted toward specific individuals. Observation Point Echo, clarify your last report, Mercer requested. You identified 3 separate movement leaders. How can you tell? Several people in the room leaned closer to their headsets. Emma answered without hesitation. Different pace. Different positioning. Everyone else adjusts to them. The room became quiet. The explanation sounded simple. Yet nobody else had noticed it. Mercer looked toward the drone operator. Can you verify? The operator enlarged the footage and studied it carefully. Nearly 2 minutes passed before he finally looked up. She is right. A few analysts exchanged surprised glances. The figures Emma identified consistently occupied positions that influenced the movement of everyone around them. Somehow she had recognized the pattern almost immediately. On the mountain ridge, Emma lowered her binoculars for a moment and recorded another note. The cold wind continued sweeping across the rocks. Frost covered sections of her equipment. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. None of it seemed to affect her concentration. Years earlier, an instructor had told her that observation was not about eyesight. It was about discipline. Most people looked. Few people truly observed. Emma had never forgotten the difference. Back at Falcon Base, Master Sergeant Bennett stood silently near the operations display. Earlier that evening he had openly questioned the assignment. Now he found himself studying every report coming from the ridge. What bothered him was not that Emma was performing well. What bothered him was how effortlessly she appeared to be doing it. He watched another update appear on the screen. Again, Emma identified developing activity before anyone else. Bennett frowned. How long has she been with this unit? A nearby officer answered. Almost 18 months. Bennett looked surprised. I do not remember hearing much about her. The officer gave a small smile. That is because she does not spend much time talking about herself. At 4 o'clock in the morning, another transmission arrived from Observation Point Echo. This time Emma's tone remained calm, but the message carried greater urgency. Movement is becoming more coordinated. Recommend elevated readiness across all sectors. Captain Mercer immediately issued additional instructions throughout the base. Personnel moved quickly. Communications channels became busier. Vehicles were prepared. Defensive positions were reviewed. Yet even as the entire base increased readiness, one fact remained unchanged. The most important eyes in the valley still belonged to a woman sitting alone on a frozen ridge, quietly seeing what everyone else was only beginning to understand. At 4:30 in the morning, the valley looked deceptively calm. From a distance, nothing appeared unusual. The roads were empty. The scattered buildings remained dark. The ridgeline sat motionless beneath the fading night sky. Yet Emma Carter knew better. Through hours of observation, she had watched separate movements slowly connect into a larger pattern. What others saw as isolated activity, she recognized as coordination. She adjusted her optics and focused on a narrow section of terrain nearly 2 miles from her position. Several groups that had been traveling independently were now converging toward the same area. None of them moved quickly. None of them appeared careless. Whoever was directing the activity understood patience. Inside Falcon Base, Captain Mercer stood beside the operations table studying fresh intelligence updates. The drone feeds now confirmed much of what Emma had been reporting throughout the night. Analysts continued mapping routes across the valley, drawing lines between locations that had initially seemed unrelated. The result was unsettling. Multiple paths led toward strategic positions surrounding the sector. Mercer looked toward the communications station. Get me Observation Point Echo. Seconds later Emma answered. Go ahead. Anything changed? Mercer asked. Emma remained silent for a moment as she continued observing. Yes, she finally replied. The pattern is tightening. Several officers exchanged glances. Mercer understood exactly what she meant. The movements were becoming more deliberate. Less exploratory. More purposeful. He thanked her and ended the transmission. Nearby, Master Sergeant Bennett continued watching the reports arrive. Earlier, he had doubted the mission assignment. Now he found himself relying on information from the very person he had questioned. What impressed him most was not the accuracy of Emma's observations. It was the consistency. Hour after hour, fatigue never seemed to affect her judgment. Her reports remained clear, concise, and precise. Meanwhile, on the ridge, Emma recorded another series of notes. The eastern approaches showed increased organization. Activity along the southern routes had become more disciplined. Several individuals appeared repeatedly across different observations, coordinating movement without drawing attention to themselves. Most observers would never have noticed. Emma did. Her focus shifted toward a cluster of structures near the center of the valley. During previous nights, the location had remained inactive. Tonight was different. Subtle signs suggested the area had become important. She marked it immediately. Minutes later, the drone operator independently identified the same location. "Sir," he called across the command center, "I think we found a focal point." Captain Mercer walked over and examined the feed. Then he looked toward the communications console with a faint smile. "Let me guess. Emma already reported it." The operator nodded. A few people laughed quietly. Even Bennett allowed himself a small grin. The atmosphere inside the room had changed. Doubt was gradually being replaced by respect. Yet Emma remained completely unaware of those conversations. Her attention stayed fixed on the valley below. The first faint signs of dawn were beginning to appear along the eastern horizon. Darkness slowly gave way to shades of gray. As visibility improved, so did the picture developing in front of her. Details that had been hidden all night became easier to recognize. Distances felt shorter. Shapes became clearer. And with every passing minute, Emma grew more certain of one thing. Whatever was developing in the valley had not happened by accident. It had been planned carefully, patiently, and long before anyone at Falcon Base realized it was unfolding. She reached for her radio once more. Her voice remained calm as always. "Falcon Base, recommend full readiness. Sunrise is going to answer a lot of questions." The first sunlight touched the highest ridges just after 5 in the morning. Long shadows stretched across the valley, revealing details that darkness had concealed for hours. From Observation Point Echo, Emma Carter watched the landscape transform beneath the growing light. What had appeared scattered during the night now looked unmistakably organized. Routes intersected with purpose. Positions complemented one another. Activity concentrated around key terrain features that controlled movement throughout the sector. She adjusted her optics and continued tracking developments. Back at Falcon Base, the command center had become fully alert. Every workstation was occupied. Fresh intelligence reports arrived continuously. Drone feeds covered multiple sections of the valley. Yet despite the technology filling the room, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Emma continued identifying critical developments before anyone else. Captain Mercer reviewed another set of observations and noticed something unusual. Certain locations that Emma had highlighted throughout the night now appeared increasingly important. He pointed toward the map. "Why those positions?" An analyst examined the overlays for several moments before answering. If someone wanted to coordinate movement across the valley, those locations would provide the best control. Mercer nodded slowly. Emma had recognized that hours earlier. Nearby, Master Sergeant Bennett stood quietly watching the discussion unfold. He remembered his comments during the briefing. At the time, they had seemed reasonable. Now they felt different. Every update from the ridge reinforced the same uncomfortable realization. He had underestimated the person carrying out the mission. On the mountain, Emma reached for her radio. Falcon Base, activity continues increasing near the central corridor. Her voice remained calm despite the growing complexity of the situation. Multiple groups are adjusting movement based on signals originating from the same area. The transmission immediately drew attention inside the command center. Analysts redirected sensors and communications specialists reviewed intercepted traffic. Within minutes they discovered indicators supporting Emma's assessment. The adjustment patterns were real. Someone was coordinating events across a large section of the valley. A young intelligence officer looked up from his workstation. How does she keep seeing this before everyone else? No one answered immediately. Finally, an older analyst smiled faintly. Because she is looking for relationships instead of individual events. The explanation lingered in the room. Most personnel focused on what was happening. Emma focused on why it was happening. That difference allowed her to see patterns others missed. As the morning progressed, more evidence emerged supporting her observations. Several positions she had marked became focal points for activity. Routes she had identified as important proved increasingly significant. The confidence within the command center began shifting. People were no longer questioning her assessments. They were building plans around them. Even Bennett noticed the change. He crossed the room and approached Captain Mercer. How much do we actually know about Carter? Mercer glanced at him. What do you mean? Bennett folded his arms. I mean her background. Training. Assignments. Anything. Mercer looked surprised by the question. Why ask now? Bennett stared toward the operations display. Because nobody develops this level of situational awareness by accident. Before Mercer could answer, another transmission arrived from Observation Point Echo. Emma sounded as composed as ever. Recommend reviewing personnel records connected to previous regional operations. Several officers exchanged confused looks. Mercer pressed the transmit button. Why? A brief pause followed. Then Emma replied, because whoever planned this understands the valley extremely well. Silence filled the command center. It was not the observation itself that caught their attention. It was the confidence behind it. Emma was no longer describing isolated events. She was describing the mind behind them. And for the first time that morning, everyone inside Falcon Base began wondering whether there was another question they should have asked much earlier. Who exactly was Staff Sergeant Emma Carter? Captain Mercer stared at the operations display for several seconds after Emma's transmission ended. Around him, conversations resumed immediately. Analysts reviewed movement patterns. Communications personnel monitored incoming traffic. Drone operators adjusted camera angles across the valley. Yet Mercer found himself focused on a different question. Who exactly was Staff Sergeant Emma Carter? He turned toward the intelligence section. Pull her personnel file. A young officer nodded and began searching the database. Moments later, a detailed record appeared on a nearby monitor. At first glance, nothing seemed extraordinary. Years of service. Multiple deployments. Advanced training certifications. Strong evaluations. Then the officer scrolled further. The room gradually grew quieter. Specialized reconnaissance qualifications appeared. Advanced observation courses. Instructor certifications. Regional terrain analysis awards. The list continued. Master Sergeant Bennett stepped closer. The deeper they looked, the more surprising the file became. Emma had spent years studying exactly the kind of operational environments surrounding Falcon Base. Several previous assignments involved mountainous terrain nearly identical to the valley below. She had completed programs that most soldiers never even knew existed. One line in particular caught Bennett's attention. Distinguished graduate, Advanced Long-Range Observation and Reconnaissance Course. He read it twice. How did I never hear about this? The intelligence officer gave a small shrug. She never talks about it. Another document appeared. Then another. Recommendations from senior commanders described exceptional patience, unusual situational awareness, and an ability to identify developing threats before they became obvious to others. Captain Mercer leaned back slightly. Everything from the past 12 hours suddenly made more sense. Meanwhile, nearly a mile away, Emma remained focused on the valley. Morning sunlight now illuminated most of the terrain. Details hidden during darkness stood exposed beneath the growing light. Activity continued increasing across multiple sectors, but Emma's attention remained fixed on the relationships connecting them. The larger picture had become clearer. She transmitted another report. Movement remains coordinated. Activity is spreading outward from previously identified locations. Her voice sounded exactly the same as it had throughout the night. Calm. Measured. Unhurried. Back at Falcon Base, the report appeared alongside drone imagery confirming her assessment once again. Several analysts exchanged knowing looks. Nobody seemed surprised anymore. In fact, many had started waiting for Emma's observations before reaching their own conclusions. Bennett noticed the shift. Earlier, people had questioned whether she could handle the assignment. Now experienced officers were quietly relying on her judgment. He folded his arms and stared at the personnel file still displayed on the monitor. One final section remained unopened. The intelligence officer clicked it. Additional commendations appeared, many connected to observation missions requiring long periods of isolation and independent decision-making. Bennett exhaled slowly. She was probably the best choice for that ridge all along. Mercer glanced toward him but said nothing. There was no need. Everyone in the room had reached the same conclusion. Outside the command center, the base continued preparing for whatever the day might bring. Vehicles moved into position. Equipment was checked. Patrol schedules were adjusted. Yet the most valuable asset in the entire sector remained exactly where she had been since midnight. Alone on a frozen ridgeline, watching, listening, and understanding the valley better than anyone else. And as the morning continued unfolding, one realization became impossible to ignore. The assignment everyone had doubted was beginning to look less like a risk and more like a decision made by someone who knew precisely what Emma Carter was capable of. Shortly after noon, the situation across the valley began settling into something far more predictable than anyone had expected. The uncertainty that had dominated the night slowly gave way to clarity. Routes that seemed mysterious now made sense. Locations that appeared random revealed their purpose. Hours of observation, analysis, and preparation had transformed confusion into understanding. Inside Falcon Base, the command center finally felt different. The tension remained, but it was no longer driven by uncertainty. It was driven by confidence. Captain Mercer stood near the operations table reviewing the latest reports. Every major assessment generated during the morning matched the picture Emma Carter had been building since the middle of the night. What had started as isolated observations had become the foundation for the base's entire understanding of the valley. The realization was impossible to ignore. Nearby, Master Sergeant Bennett remained unusually quiet. Throughout his career, he had learned that experience was valuable, but he had also learned something equally important. Experience meant very little if it prevented a person from recognizing excellence when they saw it. He glanced once more at Emma's personnel file before closing it. The records explained her qualifications. They explained her training. They explained her achievements. But they still did not fully explain what everyone had witnessed over the last 12 hours. Because what impressed people most was not what Emma knew. It was how she carried herself. She never demanded recognition. She never reminded anyone of her accomplishments. She simply did the job. High above the valley, Emma continued monitoring her sector as sunlight filled every corner of the landscape. The long shadows of dawn had disappeared. The terrain now stretched clearly in every direction. Her notebook contained pages of observations accumulated throughout the mission. Her equipment remained organized exactly as it had been when she arrived. Despite spending the entire night alone on the ridge, her focus never appeared to fade. When Falcon Base finally transmitted instructions for her return, her response was as calm as every report that had come before it. Understood. Beginning movement shortly. No celebration. No dramatic speech. Just another professional acknowledgement. Several hours later, Emma walked through the gates of Falcon Base carrying the same pack she had taken up the mountain. Conversations slowed as soldiers noticed her crossing the compound. Some had followed her reports throughout the night. Others had heard only fragments of what happened. Yet nearly everyone seemed to understand the same thing. The mission had succeeded because the right person had been placed in the right position. Near the operations building, Master Sergeant Bennett stepped forward. Emma stopped. For a moment, neither person spoke. Then Bennett extended his hand. "I owe you an apology." Emma looked at him calmly. "For what?" Bennett gave a small laugh. "For believing the position was bigger than the person assigned to it." Emma shook his hand. "The position was never the important part." Bennett raised an eyebrow. "What was?" Emma adjusted the strap on her pack before answering. "Preparation." The word lingered in the air after she spoke it. Not confidence. Not luck. Not talent. Preparation.